Okay. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, I see it.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to start and we'll have more people as they join. Okay. Everybody, just to let you know, sorry, you've been muted as soon as you joined the webinar. That's because we don't want any interruptions or any sort of distractions while we're talking. But then please feel free to unmute when we get to the discussion point of the webinar. Namaste, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody based on which part of the world you are joining us from. I am Ritika and I'm a research consultant with George Washington University, and I'll be your moderator for the webinar today. We are currently in the 10th webinar of the Nepal Mental Health Research webinar series, which is on reassessing the mental health treatment gap, results and reflections from ethnographic study on Nepali traditional healing. Our speaker today is Dr. Tony Pham, and we will get to him in a little bit. But a couple of quick housekeeping things before we move on with the webinar. I would like to let everybody know that the webinar is being recorded. That is mostly because we share webinar recordings, these slides, and other materials that we have at the end of the webinar with everybody who has registered for the webinar. We hope that we have everybody's consent to be being recorded. This webinar is mostly going to be in English. However, we have a discussion event later that I'm going to come to, which can be in both Nepali and English, whichever language that you're comfortable in. We will start with a roughly 15 minutes of presentation, after which we will have a 10 to 15 minutes question, answer, and discussion session. Our co-moderators will be helping us with the discussion session. After 15 minutes of discussion and question answers, which will be centered mostly around the presentation, about any questions that you may have on the presentation, about any questions you may have on the study, and our speakers' experiences. But after that, we have 15 minutes allocated for breakout rooms. Our speaker has also provided us with discussion questions, and in the individual breakout rooms, we will be smaller groups of 3-4 people, where we will discuss in depth the questions that our speaker has provided us, which will be based on the presentation and on the research that we will hear about. After that, we will take around 5 minutes to wrap up, in which all the groups as moderators will come back to the main room and will summarize the findings of the discussion questions. So all in all, it's going to be an action-packed webinar that we're all very excited about. Our webinar is, as we talked about earlier, it's a series of webinars. We have monthly webinars on the 3rd week of every English month, which we will continue to do. We will be taking a break in the month of June, however, because we've been doing this for a year and we want to start fresh in July again with renewed vigor and energy and with more participants than ever before. We will continue to keep up information on our Twitter page, on our Facebook page that you can see on our screen, as well as we have the email address there. No need to write it down because, like I said, we'll be sharing these information with you. Super quickly, we will also be sharing a feedback form with you because we want to talk more about how we can collectively improve the way our webinars are going on. And we'll be sharing the feedback form with you towards the second half of the webinar. I'll keep you updated and provide more information as we go along. As I said earlier, our speaker today is Dr. Tony Pham, and we have Professor Brandon Fort from George Washington University to introduce our speaker and get us started with the webinar.
Great, thanks so much, Ritika, and a huge thanks to Tony for his willingness to present today. I know he's very busy, about to submit a major grant, which we all wish him best of luck that it gets funded. So I've had the pleasure of working with Tony for a number of years now, I think at least since 2016, so going on 6 years. Plus or minus. So Tony currently works as a psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, associated with Harvard University. He received a BA in psychology and cognitive science at the University of Virginia, Around that time, he also volunteered extensively with post-Hurricane Katrina survivors and went on to pursue his medical degree at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. During medical school, he also volunteered in the New Orleans area before transitioning to facilitate a survivor program following the 2011 earthquake in Japan associated with the tsunami and associated nuclear disaster. After medical school, he completed psychiatry residency at Duke University, which is where I had the pleasure of starting to work with him during a master's in global health training program. So he also has an MSc in global health. During that time, he conducted a project that examined the role of spirituality among chronic kidney disease patients. Also, as a part of the Duke Global Health Pathway, he received an NIH Fogarty International Fellowship, and he investigated the intersection between Nepali traditional healers and conventional psychotherapy. More recently, in Boston, he completed a Harvard postdoctoral fellowship that examined the role of culture as treatment among American Indian communities. So what's really great about Tony's work is kind of the multicultural nature of looking at traditional healing aspects of culture. So he doesn't bring kind of a monocultural lens to this, but really thinks about really diverse settings. And I think what's really exciting about today's presentation is he'll be taking some of his experiences and findings from the Nepal work and also putting it in the broader context of his work with American Indians and other forms of traditional and cultural healing. So thank you so much for making the time, Tony. My apologies in advance. I have to hop out 15 minutes early during the discussion, but I'm here until then and might pester you with questions in the chat as we go along. Over to you, Tony. Thanks so much.
Thanks again. I'm gonna just start off by turning off my video and then screen sharing. Let's see here. Okay, can everyone see this okay?
Yes, thank you, Tony.
Okay. I'm going to start on the first slide. Oops. Yeah. All right. Well, again, this talk is called Reassessing the Mental Health Treatment Gap, Results and Reflections of My Ethnographic Study on Nepali Traditional Healing. Obviously, I'm going to be quite brief, and I'm going to give a broad overview in terms of the topics that I'd like to discuss. But in general, I'd like to talk about the two primary studies that I completed writing manuscripts for and submitted and had them accepted. And I'd like to talk specifically on the matter of collaboration between traditional healers and biomedical providers, looking at it through the lens of, obviously Nepal, but also some of my own experiences with other communities in American Indian communities, or even my own background as a Vietnamese American researcher. And I'd like to also talk about my experiences doing research in Nepal, specifically my reflections on how to make the research pool more diverse by making the research tools more accessible. So without further ado, I'll start clicking through. So this first one, let's see if I can move this over here. Hope there's not a big black thing.
You are on mute, Tony.
Whoopsie. Okay. Can everyone hear me again?
Yes, yes, thank you so much.
I think that I clicked the mute button on accident.
No
Thank you
worries.
for alerting me there. Let's see. Just going to click back to where I was. And so just in case everyone didn't hear me, this is going to be on the paper recently submitted about honestly our work in mostly Morang, but some other southeastern regions of Nepal as well. And it focused a lot on collaborations between biomedical providers and Nepali traditional healers. And before I get into that too, sorry, I'm just trying to organize this in terms of the slides, but I want to talk about how how pervasive traditional healing still is within the greater global context. And so, here you see a picture of Hmong shamans, which, could be even compared to practices similar to what I personally am related to as a Buddhist Vietnamese person, or perhaps within, say, like, the Lama or Tamang traditions in Nepal and so forth. Here you have doctors and spiritual healers from Black communities where I'm with whom I'm currently working in Boston. In Africa as well, there's a strong history of traditional healers. In fact, I think most of the literature on traditional healing has tended to focus on Africa, even though, as everyone here knows, there's a lot of traditional healing still going on in Nepal and other Asian countries as well. In the US, you have these kind of like mountain doctors. And last year, I focused a lot of my time studying traditional healer practices in the American Indian community, also known as, Native American. Going forward, I wanted to talk a little bit about, some of the American Indian rituals as well. I think it's interesting to note simply because a lot of the American Indian rituals have been suppressed through the decades and the centuries that they've been in existence, because they were seen as very different from the imperialistic powers that came into the US. And so a lot of Native Americans were forcibly put into schools and taught to be more American, and taught to essentially give up their practices that were considered savage or too traditional for modern society. But still, there's a lot of growth in terms of sweat lodges and healing circles and other traditional practices in American Indian communities, also known as Native American, because they've been so therapeutic in their own way. And I think that's where a lot of the work from my senior mentor, Joseph Gahn, went into. He was studying the impact of culture as treatment. And I mentioned this because I think that has some parallels somewhat with where Nepal is currently, where there is a intersection between modernism and perhaps preservation of culture and traditions. And so you sort of see this dynamic a lot, at least I did, in the rural parts of Nepal. And then before I get into like the main paper I'd like to discuss, I also wanted to bring up some results that came about from a pilot study that led into it. And this happened in 2018, actually, but I know the paper was published in 2020. And this was actually in the Sindhupachal region of central Nepal, more specifically in Dumza, which I don't know if many people have been to, but it's certainly where I collected all the data. And I won't go into the details of this this diagram, but it essentially captures what we had investigated in Dumza. And the idea was we did, primarily ethnography. We also did semi-structured interviews. And interestingly, we did some structured observational ratings of the traditional healers we interacted with in Nepal, as many of you know, also known as Dami Jankri, or Jankri or Dami and so forth. And here, basically what we're depicting is the process or the mechanisms by which people would go to see the traditional healer or the biomedical provider, and how they would interpret their own stressors or complaints and so forth. And so here you see, if I don't know if you can see my mouse, I don't think so, but the beginning of what could be the psychosocial complaint. Maybe it's like tension or some kind of stressor in their life. Maybe something related to an issue with rebuilding their house or financial issues. The list goes on. But I think what's important here is the idea that, with any kind of complaint, there involves a certain level of self-interpretation. What is going on? What does this mean? And how do I convey this to someone who I'm seeking help from? And I think that what's important here is probably the idea that a lot of what goes into this idea of self-interpretation is sociological barriers. So this could include stigma, perhaps around mental health issues, a lack of medical literacy, so not understanding how to convey things in, say, psychological terms, social oppression, and at the end of the day, this person will perhaps prefer to talk about the more biological complaints, so maybe like pain or gastric and so forth. But I think that another way is often talking about it with, say, the traditional healer in terms that may be more, as we put it, magical religiously described. So, things that may deal with gods or curses. And in doing so, you can see how there is a very complex way of seeking care, kind of going further down this diagram, and people seeking care either, say, through biomedical providers or through traditional healers. And this kind of limbo or this middle ground where people go back and forth between them because they haven't quite found their, satisfaction. Or I think in several of the interviews from this paper, people called it Atma Santushti. So this idea of just finding some happiness where they find resolution, as you can see at the bottom here. And through this process, at least from a traditional healer perspective, there are many techniques involved. From a diagnostic perspective, at least watching them, maybe doing some divination, even techniques that look biomedical, and going down treatments, chanting mantra, maybe blowing fukne, going into like a deep state of chinta. And in terms of mechanisms, it could be very theoretically wide, but at least from the perspective of the research, there was a lot of overlap with psychotherapy, social support, maybe even psychotherapeutic ideas such as transference or symbolic narration and so forth. And then, sorry, I should have used these pictures. They're quite bigger, but you can kind of see the detail better. So this is the paper I think I wanted to focus more on. And this is the paper that was published more recently. This is a paper that was in Morung, and it's explored a lot in terms of the pathways to care. So how people tended to find treatment and what they would do to find resolution in their treatment in reference to the previous paper. And here you kind of see a lot of arrows. And I know it's a bit confusing if you don't read the entire paper, but the arrows essentially indicate, the amount of input that people were giving to us about their own pathways to care or their own beliefs and so forth. And so here, the blue arrows and the green arrows and the red arrows represent traditional healers, community members, or even providers. And so here, the blue represents providers, the red represents the community members, and the green represents the traditional healers. And you can kind of see how most of them kind of have talked about care-seeking behavior as being driven by a combination of both scientific, but also more traditional beliefs. And you can see how the pathways to care are quite complicated too, whereas you see, a lot of people going to doctors only. You also see a lot of people going to both clinicians and healers. And then you see, a number of people, not many or majority, but at least a sizable amount going to traditional healers only. And in terms of the split from, say, people who go to see the clinicians and the healers, what tended to happen was, they would either obviously see the doctor or the psychologist first, or they would see the traditional healer first. In the case of seeing the traditional healer first, it was very common. Basically, they would see the healer first, but in this day and age, everyone knew that you had to see the doctor as well, and eventually they would see the doctor. And there tended not to be really many issues there because from our experience talking with traditional healers, they were very mindful of the fact that, in terms of their care, they were limited in terms of issues that might be more acute or pressing, such as a bone fracture, or perhaps even more severe psychotic illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. But what was interesting was the idea of the individuals who saw the doctor first, and how complicated care could get depending on how convinced they were of the doctor's treatment. And so for individuals who might not have concern for, say, other issues going on, whether perhaps issues, again, related to spiritual concerns, maybe being cursed or being punished by the gods, it was very simple. They would just go see a traditional healer afterwards. But sometimes if there was concern that they had issues, but the doctor perhaps wouldn't be able to understand them, they oftentimes just wouldn't talk about, their other magical religious concerns with the doctor, and instead do things that were almost behind the doctor's back. So some people would, have traditional healers come into the hospital without telling anyone. Some people would leave the hospital too quickly against medical advice to say, go see a healer. And others would just simply go and see many other doctors and kind of repeat the investigations of various complaints, whether pain or stomach upset, over and over, even though the doctors were doing the same thing. And here again, you can kind of see a bigger version of it. And I realized I probably will just use the last 5 minutes, if I'm judging my time correctly, on a little bit of my reflections. And so in terms of the 2019-2020 project, the one in Morong, we did talk a lot about, what the community preferences were for collaboration in light of what seemed to be a very confusing experience for a lot of people seeking care. And one idea was the idea of even training traditional healers in biomedical concepts so that they could be perhaps more quick to refer individuals to emergency care if there was an issue, or perhaps even to give basic medical services in the rural communities where perhaps people are more prone to seeing traditional healers and so forth. So maybe like first aid and other basic low intensity skills, even perhaps psychotherapy. The other is like a two-way referral between traditional healers and biomedical providers. So not really trying to train one service and the other, but perhaps opening up the line of communication so that at least people can feel more open to see both if they feel inclined to do so. And then the other is perhaps a more less direct approach, and it's just the simple matter of opening up the lines of communication between people in the community, e.g. the traditional healers and doctors or psychologists and so forth who may be working in more clinical contexts, so that they can come up with ideas or perhaps figure out ways to collaborate so that people aren't lost to care, perhaps going down either just the clinical care or just the biomedical care, or trying to do something in between, but perhaps confusing their providers. Sorry about that, I pressed the wrong button. And I just wanted to reflect quickly on some of my experiences doing ethnography in Nepal. And, I think the biggest point that I walked away from was just the idea of how important it was, especially for my own career development. It really helped set a foundation for understanding issues on a very community level. But I think it was also very important from a research perspective because it collected very nuanced and very deep data in terms of, what was going on a community level in rural areas where perhaps less research was going on. And it helped me to really connect with people. At the same time, in my studies, I kind of combined ethnography with other things such as structured qualitative analysis. I also combined it with the ENAC scale. That was the structured observational rating scale. But here you can see what other people had done too, whether it was, doing case series with one person, other people were using mobile tools, I think there are other modalities in neuroscience that have opened up since the 1980s and so forth, when a lot of this ethnography happened. So there's a lot of ideas that could happen in the future. And another thing that I picked up on was how limited I was as an ethnographer. You know, I'm American, I'm also male, and I think that took away from the conversations that I wanted to have, say, with Nepalis or even women, because I think that there were a lot of issues that they just quite frankly didn't feel comfortable with. Maybe it was, you know, a woman who wanted to talk with another female researcher, or even perhaps a person who wanted to talk with a Nepali researcher, especially again in the context of ethnography. And in terms of my research, I actually did the last study, the one in Morong, as well as other places in Nepal, using specifically just my phone, which I think could be crazy sounding, but I did it because I wanted to explore how to open up the road to research for people who may not be able to because they can't afford things like in vivo or a laptop and so forth. And quite frankly, I won't get into the details of it, but I was able to do it. It was harder, but it was certainly possible. And that was sort of my approach to how, you know, perhaps including more diverse researchers, whether, you know, Nepali women or Nepalis from underrepresented groups in research. So that's really all I have. I hope that should be enough to start some conversation in the breakout groups. I'm gonna try to stop sharing my screen right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tony. That was a very interesting presentation. A lot to think about. A couple of things before we go ahead with our question answer session. We have two co-moderators today. One is Sujainman Moharjan, who is a lecturer at Tribhuvan University. And we also have Binita Acharya, who's a junior research officer with TPO Nepal. You may go ahead and put in your questions on the chat box, or you may use the raise your hand feature to ask questions. Completely over to you, Sujan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ritika. Now we'll move on to the question and answer section. So if anybody have a question or any comments, you can put it in the chat box as Ritika mentioned, or you can directly unmute yourself and ask him directly as well.
I have one comment. Sorry to hop.
Okay.
In the slide with the first traditional healer, Tony, there is this whole, one of the things that I couldn't help but notice was that there is this room with a television, and it seems like such a modern room, and there are like all these amenities, and the current mood, the current idea, especially when it comes to countries like Nepal, is that it's mostly people who are not as, and forgive me for saying this, I'm just putting forth a popular notion, it's people who are not educated, people who do not have faith in scientific beliefs, people who cannot afford otherwise, who are seeking such avenues of traditional healing. And that to me is extreme. The picture speaks so much, and then your presentation goes around and addresses it directly. I just found that fascinating.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I especially think because of the current times where people are seeing a lot of different cultures coming together with, you know, easier communication, and people are very influenced by other ways of living. And I know in the US, it's been interesting too, because in a way that modernization, although you know, still going on, I think in a way some people still feel lost in terms of finding meaning in their own lives, and have been turning towards tradition and other ways of looking at, you know, what does it mean to be you know, a meaningful person in the world. And I think in that respect, at least again in the US, a lot of people started to turn back to like religion and other kind of things that people had put aside before. And in Nepal, I know that there's sort of the idea that the more traditional people or the more uneducated people turn to traditional healers. But I think another thing that I started to see a lot too was, like, say in Kathmandu, there was a lot of people still going to see traditional healers, if anything, sometimes more frequently than the places that I also worked in, say like in, again, like Morang or in the far western parts of Nepal. And it made me wonder, just how important perhaps the ideas of tradition and other means of finding meaning in the world might be for Nepalis, even if the people are finding TVs more in their room, or people are finding more technology and so forth. They may themselves be looking for other things or other reasons to live or find meaning in when they're, say, sick or just simply confused or lost. It's really nice to see some of my old friends too. I haven't talked to a lot of people, at least during the pandemic, or after then or before, just simply because of how busy things have been.
I wanted to jump in with a question before I have to hop off and just say, Tony, I'm really curious, how do you think the work in Nepal has informed your work with American Indians? And has anything about your work with American Indians over the past 2 years led you to think differently about some of the things you observed in Nepal?
Oh, okay. I think that in terms of going from work between Nepal and American Indian communities, I was very influenced by the fact that there was just an undercurrent of desire within a community that suggested that the way that we deliver care may not actually help those people in that undercurrent. And so, say in Nepal, I was very influenced by a group of people who simply just didn't want to go see the doctor or the clinician or the psychologist. They wanted to do other things in addition. And I think that I sort of walked into the American Indian research with that in mind, and it helped me be prepared for simply a way of thinking that didn't necessarily align with the conventional notions of psychiatric illness and treatment. And it definitely informed me about the importance of more anthropological or ethnographic work in studying these undercurrents, because I think that, maybe in Nepal or even in the US, there's sort of a movement away from these methodologies. But the work I did in Nepal, interestingly, really inspired me to keep that with me. And in terms of the other way around, maybe like how the American Indian research has influenced the work that I had done and continue to do in Nepal, I think a lot of it was the idea that, in the US at least, there's been a lot of history towards reparations to repay the American Indian community. And so there's more, structure in terms of, the work that can be done. And I think that it was interesting to see how that funding, whether through like Indian Health Services or from the government, has done to almost come back and reinvigorate the culture as treatment movement that Joseph Gahn has been a strong part of. And it made me think just in terms of almost like a hope that perhaps if there was broader funding from a global perspective, or in Nepal from a governmental perspective, how there could be almost like a culture as treatment movement, say in Nepal, wherein people obviously seek care through conventional means, but also find meaning in their lives through what it means to be Nepali, even as we're fast approaching a time where there's a lot of Americanization going on, or European influence, or influence from other Asian countries, China, India, and so forth. The list goes on. And so, yeah.
Great, thanks so much.
We'll take a few more questions. So if anybody has a question, please free to ask Tony.
Sure, Susan. Hi, Tony.
Hi, Zohara.
Hey, yeah, so I'm just trying to shift the gear and then focus on the methodological aspect of your research, especially just wanted to talk about the gender dimension of ethnographic research. So like my own research required me to do some ethnographic work with women. So one of the limitation of my work was like how I could talk about things like mental health, mental well-being, emotions, and then sometimes adds sensitive as sexuality and all. So it was hard for me as a male. And then I just wanted to, hear about your experience as a male. And then on top of that, as a foreigner, like how did you navigate all of those things, and then also navigate things like research ethics and like like a lot of things come up together. So just wanted to hear about your experience in that.
Well, first of all, it's good to hear your voice. I hope Lalina's doing okay in pediatric residency. I think that what was really interesting for me was the number of mata that I encountered in both Kathmandu and in the rural areas. And I remember talking to them pretty upfront, and I asked them, why are there so many female traditional healers these days, relative perhaps before? It just seems interesting to me. And a lot of your clients are women. And, but they would never say like, oh, it's because of XYZ issue. They just would say, there's more of us. So I never really got down to the understanding of the why, but I certainly thought about it, and it just made me think that perhaps from a therapeutic perspective that, in the same way that my parents may prefer to go see Vietnamese doctors and so forth, perhaps, in the same way that I've been rejected, say, as a obstetrician, as a medical student, women saying like, I don't want to see this male doctor. I could see how a lot of women may prefer to see perhaps like a female healer, just to talk perhaps about personal issues, or again, whether it comes to sexuality or maybe like interpersonal issues that they may be facing. As far as being a foreigner goes, I think it sort of helped that I looked a bit Mongolian. I know that a lot of people just assumed that I was like Tamang or something, or Rai, and I would have to like convince them. Actually, one man, he like wouldn't accept the fact that I wasn't Nepali. And I didn't argue with him, but I did say like, oh, I'm from Vietnam. And he gave me a very like elaborate theory. He said that, like, I remember I was staying at his place, and he said, no. He woke up the next morning. He was like, I understand now. And he said to me that he was talking about the Vietnam War and how there was a lot of Nepalis who went over there. And he said he had the theory that that there was actually a lot of people like myself who were actually Nepali, and that my last name Pham was actually like a misspelling of Tamang, and that I was actually Tamang, and I didn't know it. And at that point, I was just like, okay. So I think there was a lot of that happened, where people just assumed, no matter what I said, that I was Nepali, and so the foreignness kind of, for better or worse, wasn't an issue.
Yeah, I just remember, Tony, that your name was actually Dilke Gurung, right?
Yeah.
Gurung
That's
for a very long
Renasha.
time. Like, yeah, that was a very long time. Was that a strategy that you are trying to play to make people know that like, you are Nepali and be more open?
I thought about it. I know that when Renasha gave me that name, I thought it was cool. And then somebody told me that it was in a condom commercial or something. So I ended up not using it, but I thought it was funny. I used it on Facebook at least.
Thanks, Tony, for this reflection.
That's very interesting to hear your experience in Nepal, Tony. Very funny as well. So now we will move on with the breakout session. So we have a few questions and then we'll discuss in smaller groups and then we'll get back and share those things. Over to you, Ritika.
Thank you, Sujan. We will have 3 breakout rooms. Group 1, Tony's, you may please focus more on questions 1 and 2 as we just discussed. And Vinita ji and Sujan, please focus more on questions 1 and 3. And yeah, we will reconvene in 10 minutes and quickly go over our discussions. Thank you so much. I'm opening the rooms now. तपाईँहरूको रुमको डिस्कसनहरू सकेको हो टोपजी अश्मिताजी?
ए ला म त अर्कै रुममा आएँ कि के भयो भर्खर लिभ भयो जस्तो छ अनि फेरि
रुम्सहरू क्लोज भइरहेको
के भन्दा नि एउटा टाइम लिमिट रहेछ जस हामी 3 जना चाहिँ बोल्यौं एन्ड देन आफै शिफ्ट भयो यो चाहिँ
मेरो पनि त्यही भयो
या टाइम टाइम लिमिट चाहिँ अलिक कम भयो जस्तो भयो म्याम त्यसमा चाहिँ
त्यो भएको एकदम राम्रो होइन भन्नु त धेरै गएको
त्यही त
घन्टाको वेबिनार भएको कारणले अलिकति सर्ट एन्ड चाहिँ छ के हामी हाम्रो पार्टिसिपेन्ट्स घट्नु भएछ can we quickly take 1 minute each अनि Vinitaji, we can start with you. Vinitaji, Sujan, and Tony. Tony or Soharda, either of you, if we all could summarize our discussion in a minute.
Yeah, I could summarize it. You know, we were talking a lot about collaboration, actually, and we were learning a lot about Asmitaji's experiences as a psychiatric nurse and understanding her experiences working at the intersection between people in rural areas who may have multiple concerns and multiple ideas for treating, and the importance of essentially working hand in hand together to avoid repeating care or duplicating care, or as Soharda was saying, you know, working in circles and having people kind of go in terms of loops, trying to find something that helps them find satisfaction.
That's really interesting. Vinitaji, could you tell us a bit about your group discussion?
Hello.
हजुर विनिताजी तपाईकोहरुकोमा पनि के कुरा भयो अलिकति भनिदिनुहुन्छ 1 मिनेटमा
Actually, as Krishnaji was there in my discussion session, and according to him, as he mentioned that society is a continuous changing, that's why there are a lot of practices changing, or due to globalization, the maximum number of migration is increasing, so that people might feel difficult to adapt all the cultures, their environment, lifestyle, which makes them it makes them feel different or have some kind of mental health problems like stress, anxiety, which is very difficult, which might be difficult for understanding the environment and also hamper the research as well. That's why ethnography is important for mental health research in Nepal, according to him. And as the strategy towards collaboration between biomedical providers and traditional healers, both of my participants in my room mentioned that we should combine both of them for the development of medical system as well, because we cannot change the belief system of people as well in Nepal or any other remote areas of old. So if we collaborate them and combine them for biomedical providers and traditional healers, then it will be better.
Thank you, Neetaji. Thank you. So Jen, could you please take it on?
Yeah, sure. So there were 5 of us in the group. So we talked about why ethnography is important. So since 1960s, we see a lot of academics have come to Nepal to study shamanism and traditional healing. And that has produced a really useful knowledge for us to know, like how it would be helpful for the people. And we know in Nepal, most of the people, the first line of, so when they go to seek the help, it's usually the traditional healers. And then because it doesn't help, then they come to the physicians or the psychiatrists. So there is also need to link between the biomedical providers and traditional healers, because both of the groups have their own role and importance in the society. So it's better to like connect them and create like the referral pathways from one side to another that could be helpful, like to help the people with mental health problems. Thank you.
That's really cool. So it seems like our entire group is at least in agreement that we should try and incorporate the various entities and different kinds of healing possibilities that we have. The path forward is collaborative and not exclusionary, seems to be the theme of our conversation here. Thank you, Dr. Tony Pham, for such an interesting and detailed presentation. Thank you to the co-moderators, and thank you to all the participants we had here. I realize we are beyond time, so I'm not going to take a lot of our time. Just two pointers. I have set up the feedback form on our chat. Please do fill out the feedback forms, because that's how we make ourselves better. And another, we will not have a webinar in June because we're taking a month off. We have finished 10 webinars this year, and we intend to come back in July stronger, and we will hope for your continued support in that. Thank you everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Pham. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.